Last Meal Monday, where every Monday I tell you about a killer on death row and what they had as their final meal. This week we're going to discuss George Barrett. George was born in 1887 and he was one of 7 children. He was raised by an incredibly abusive mother and was in and out of jail starting pretty early on, usually for things like petty theft, but as time went forward, he started making most of his money in car theft. On September 2nd, 1930, George got into an altercation with his 71-year-old mother and shot her dead. In the process of shooting her dead, he did end up also accidentally shooting his sister, Rachel. He spent 8 months on the lam for this crime, but he did eventually actually turn himself in and was arrested. He was charged with the murder, but it ultimately resulted in a hung jury and he was never convicted. As I mentioned earlier, George was making most of his money in car theft. He got so good that he actually caught the eye of the FBI, because what he was doing is he would buy a car, then he would steal the exact same car, and then sell the stolen car using the papers from the legitimate purchase. He had warrants all the way from California to Indiana. The FBI did end up tracking him until they found him in College Corner, Indiana, and they set up a stakeout. On August 16th of 1935, FBI agents Nelson Klein and Donald McGovern were doing a stakeout watching George in College Corner, Indiana. When they spotted him next to a car, agent Nelson Klein decided to give chase and chased after George. George ultimately ended up hiding behind the garage of a woman by the name of Agatha McDonough and started shooting at the FBI agents. This caused a shootout. Agent Klein returned fire. He actually ended up hitting George in both of his knees, which led George to be wheelchair bound for the rest of his life. But George shot Agent Klein 6 times, and unfortunately, Agent Nelson Klein died at the scene. George was rendered medical aid at the scene and taken to the hospital and later arrested and charged with the murder of Agent Klein. This is just kind of an interesting tidbit. The federal government had just passed a law stating that it was capital murder to shoot and kill a federal agent. So that meant George would be up for the death penalty. On December 7th, 1935, George was sentenced to death by hanging. And the reason he was sentenced to death by hanging and not the electric chair, which was Indiana's prime method of execution at the time, was because of the law I just mentioned. It specifically stated in the law that if they were sentenced to death, it would be by hanging. Indiana didn't even have a gallows at that time. They had to reach out to a farmer in a neighboring state who they could use his gallows, and they had to have it all specially built just for George. So he was sentenced to death by hanging. George was put to death on March 24th of 1936 by hanging. For his final meal, he requested the biggest steak in town, but he didn't actually eat it. A reporter found it in the kitchen after the execution and ate it themselves. And that brings us to the end of